Good afternoon and welcome to our Distinguished Visitor Lecture Series. I'm honored and delighted to be able to introduce our speaker, who's going to talk about democracy, a critical topic in these very intense times of environmental and economic uncertainty. Our speaker, a graduate of Dalhousie Law School and a member of the Nova Scotia and Ontario bars, is an activist lawyer. She has a long record for advocating for social justice, the environment, human rights, and for pragmatic economic solutions. She first became known in the Canadian media in the mid-1970s when she was in her 20s, through her leadership as a volunteer in the grassroots movement against aerial insecticide spraying that was proposed for forests near her home on Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia. This effort prevented aerial insecticide spraying from ever occurring in Nova Scotia. Years later, she and a local group of residents went to court to prevent herbicide spraying. Winning a temporary injunction in 1982 was enough to hold off the spray program, but after 2 years, the case was eventually lost. In the course of the litigation, her family sacrificed their home and 70 acres of land in an adverse court ruling to Scott Paper. However, by the time the judge ruled that the chemicals were safe, 2,4,5-T's export from the United States had been banned. The forests of Nova Scotia were spared, being the last areas in Canada to be sprayed with Agent Orange. Since that time, she's continued her legal activism in seeking change and has served the Canadian and global communities in a number of different ways. In 1986, only 3 years after graduating from law school, she became the senior policy advisor to then Federal Environment Minister Tom McMillan. She was instrumental in creating several national parks, including South Moresby. She was involved in negotiating the Montreal Protocol to protect the ozone layer and pollution control measures. She has served on numerous boards of environmental groups and advisory bodies to universities and governments in Canada, including the Earth Charter Commission, co-chaired by Maurice Strong and Mikhail Gorbachev. Currently, she's leader of the Green Party of Canada. She has worked extensively with Indigenous peoples internationally, particularly in the Amazon, as well as with Canadian First Nations. She has taught courses at Queen's University of Policy Studies and established a program in women's health and environment at Dalhousie. And she has authored 7 books, some of which include How to Save the World in Your Spare Time, Global Warming for Dummies with Zoe Karen, and most recently, Losing Confidence, Power Politics and the Crisis in Canadian Democracy. She was named an officer of the Order of Canada in 2005, and in 2006, she was named one of the world's leading women environmentalists by the United Nations. She's also a mother and a grandmother. To speak to us today on greening democracy, would you please help me welcome Elizabeth May.
Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome and that lovely introduction. It doesn't seem that long ago to me, largely because I guess I'm delusional, that I was a student in law school at what we used to call it Dow Law Hour, and prominent people would come speak to us. So it seems a little odd that you're there and I'm here. But anyway, it's nice that I'm really quite honored to be part of a distinguished lecture series and a distinguished speaker series. As someone who has loved going to law school, loved practicing law, I stand before you as someone who hates politics. So the topic of the greening of democracy in the courts and in the ballot box is something that I want to share with you very personally. We must do, because the current culture of political life in this country is toxic. That's why sensible people don't want anything to do with it. And the fact that I immerse myself in a toxic and unpleasant environment on a daily basis is only because we've got to change this. And it's not going to change unless people who also think it's pretty nasty stuff decide to get in there and make it work. So in that sense, greening of democracy, and I chose the title, is not my attempt to brand everything and everybody with the name of my party, except perhaps subliminally in a very manipulative way that even I hadn't quite considered. What I really meant was the quickening of democracy, the freshening of democracy, the instilling in the heart of every citizen in a nation, in a democracy, the sense that it's not just a duty or an obligation to vote, but that the exercise of voting, and the attributes of democracy, reach the hearts and souls of citizens in a sense of empowerment. And my larger thesis, about which I'm seeing and developing even since my book came out, Losing Confidence, and by the way, I'm not personally losing confidence. I'm very concerned that Canadians as a body politic are less and less engaged in the political life of their nation, more and more likely to decide that it all doesn't really make much of a difference, and we are losing as a citizenry confidence in the institutions of our society. And among those, of course, the Parliament and the courts are among the most significant, and you are engaged in both. I also would put forward that the role of a free and independent media is another critical institution that we need in a democracy, which is also kind of on the ropes and not particularly relevant as we watch what used to be journalism descend into something on the order of entertainment and inane commentary. But I'm going to focus my remarks to you today in the time we have primarily on the two bulwarks of a functioning democracy, our system of justice, our courts, and our democratic processes. And the larger thesis I would put to you is that one of the most dangerous things that has ever consumed a society, short of totalitarian rule, fascism, or really, the raw, naked face of brutality that refuses to allow people to live freely and to breathe freely and to exercise their rights to choose their own future. Short of that brutal and visible exertion of totalitarianism, the most dangerous thing to waft over democracy is consumer culture. And I think that since I was your age and in law school till today, one of the things I think that's been the most corrosive of fundamental democracy is the notion that we are consumers in an economy more fundamentally than we are citizens in a democracy. And one of the things that happens with consumer culture is you really feel you're free to change the channel. You just can sit back on the couch, and if you don't like what's going on, choose a different channel. A thing that happens to consumers is, of course, the addiction to consumerism, but it's fundamentally disempowering. It tells you your choices are pretty, you got a lot of choices. Consumer choice is celebrated. Electoral choice, not so much. Consumer choice is celebrated. You can all go out and you exercise power in a society by how you spend your money. And I think that may be part and parcel of reduced voter turnout, because consumers are told you exercise your consumer preference by where you put your money. A lot of times now when I go door to door, and this is something that many of you will have done, I don't know how many of you have ever been active in a political party. Most Canadians wisely choose not to be. I really shouldn't fool around with this sort of thing. It would be wonderful if you were all engaged in political parties. You could help clean them up. But going door to door, what I hear from voters quite frequently, and despite the very sensible large level of concerns around youth voting, 30 and under, 25 and under is where we see the least levels of participation in voting. But right through all of Canadian society, we see fewer and fewer people choosing to get out and vote. And what I often hear on the doorstep, which has been a shock for me, getting into politics rather late in life and thinking that everybody I know votes, right? Run into people my age, good education, they look, decent homes, the kind of people you figure are going to vote. And they say, I haven't voted since 1997. Or I haven't voted since 1993. I decided to stop encouraging them. What? Them? Them? You think voting's about them? Voting's about you. It's a very strange thing, and that's where I've come to the view that it's a consumer culture phenomenon. Express your preference by saying, well, I'm just not going to do that activity. That's the way I'll show them. the rights of citizens to vote, to exert their own views of what their future should look like through expressed preference for one set of policies over another, is, I think, falling into a category that looks a lot like a reality TV show, where you're watching something that is clearly involves something like real life. Although, as Jim Travers, who's a Toronto Star columnist, was doing a CBC discussion of democracy after my book came out, we were with Michael Enright on Sunday Edition, and I described the problems that I saw in modern democracy: low voter turnout, an increasingly dictatorial prime minister's office, the loss of real cabinet government, I mentioned earlier the egregious weaknesses of journalism today. I threw in one more just for the sake of giving you a complete picture. How is it that we in a modern democracy could allow the state police to interfere in an election and never bother to find out why? An interference in the form of Zaccardelli's press release in December 2005 that arguably changed the results of the 2006 election from a liberal minority to a conservative minority. How do we allow something like that to happen and not inquire as to what that was about, at least? So in identifying these weaknesses in democracy, and when I'd done sort of savaging the status quo, Michael Enright turned to Jim Travers, who's a political columnist for the Toronto Star, and said, well, is she being unduly harsh? And Jim Travers said, well, I'd say no, she's not quite, no, everything she says is true, and I'd go farther. I'd say that we no longer have democracy in Canada. You can go to Ottawa, and what you'll see is really a democracy theme park. The buildings are still there. You can take the tour. I mean, Disney hasn't yet installed automated politicians who smile and wave like the wildlife on the Jungle Cruise, but there's something about the notion of a theme park to that. I would say now I'm looking at it and thinking, do Canadians now see the activities on Parliament Hill as sort of a bad variety reality TV show? Are they waiting to get involved till there's next season and a better bunch of characters to watch? Right? But the fact of the matter is that we are in a democracy, and the level and quality of government we get, unfortunately, we tend to get what we deserve. And when fewer and fewer people vote, and when Stephen Harper can be prime minister with 36% of the 58% of the people who voted, people who choose not to vote or who think it doesn't make much difference how they vote, can be left feeling that perhaps if we could shake that inertia and the stupor that surrounds voting and get people to vote more, we might change the outcomes. So that's a bit of a subtext. To have a full, and we have all the opportunities of democracy in Canada. We have an enormous range of rights as citizens in a country that has installed the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have the rights of citizens to choose a future for ourselves, municipally, provincially, federally. Unlike citizens in other countries, pursuing our right to vote does not hold any terrors. No one says that if they've caught us voting, they'll cut off our fingers. No one says that if they, in Zimbabwe's last election, when I saw people who were refugees from Zimbabwe willing to wade across the crocodile-infested Limpopo River to go back into Zimbabwe at risk of life and limb to make sure they vote for Changarai, and you watch voter turnout in Canada dwindle, you think, well, what is it about our voting system that is so antithetical to Canadian concerns that we see people turn away in droves? So this central concern has been driving a lot of my thinking for the last number of years, and is very much related to the issues that I think, of course, confront us that are the most serious. And I do want to draw attention, and perhaps we can pursue it in questions because it's not so much part of my remarks, but we're right now in a sensible democracy where the political parties were seized with the thing that was most important to the future of the country. Parliamentary debates would all be about the climate crisis. We would see federal provincial meetings looking at how we could do a better job to take the lead as we approach the Copenhagen negotiations. We'd be seeing discussions and debates throughout our society about what needed to be done, of course, if we were really engaged years ago, we would have lived up to commitments we'd made years ago. So bearing in mind that the issues aren't easy and that the choices before us are going to be, are going to involve some difficult decisions in which some people will be mad at the people who make the decisions no matter what they decide, a functioning democracy would put that front and center. And we'd be looking towards Copenhagen knowing that we had to make important decisions and that, frankly, if we embrace them and do them well, they're entirely to the benefit of our long-term economic health, or to the benefit of our security, and those changes need to be made. The fact that we can be so distracted by short-term concerns that we don't even see these issues raised in the House of Commons except rarely, again, is a function of a democracy that isn't working as well as it should. Now, and this point was really made to me early. Al Gore was speaking at an event we held when I was with Sierra Club back in May of 2006 in Toronto, and he was doing a pre-screening of the film An Inconvenient Truth. And in discussing the issues afterwards with an audience, he said, the climate crisis is an aspect, a symptom of the democracy crisis. Because if we really were, as citizens and democracies, engaged in the things that mattered most to us, exerted through our vote and responded to by responsible politicians who represented not just their short-term concerns as dictated to them by spin doctors, but their long-term concerns for whether they leave the country in better shape than they received it from those who were in government before, that would be our central focus. How do we respond to the largest challenge that humanity has ever faced, which is the climate crisis? And I've agreed with him ever since that this democracy crisis is part and parcel of what we must do as citizens. Now, in case I forget to mention it later, it strikes me that I want to at least say a nonpartisan shout-out of thanks to Anita Neville, who is a Liberal MP in Winnipeg, who chose to vote with the NDP and the Bloc and with the Greens, if we'd been in the room, for Bill C-311 coming back to the House of Commons. It's the Climate Accountability Act. It needed to be passed before Copenhagen, and the Conservatives and the majority of Liberals in the House, including Michael Ignatieff, voted to delay that bill so that we won't have targets in place before Copenhagen. So since Anita was one of only 14 Liberals who deviated from her party policies and position, I thought it was worth taking a chance to say thank you while I'm in Winnipeg. And I, of course, want my Green candidate to do very well in the riding against her, but it needs to be said that we all owe her a lot. So how are we going to face these dual crises? Well, to get democracy to work again, there are a few things we need to do. And then I'll get to the question of the courts. The greening of democracy in the House of Commons is going to start when political parties have less clout. It's not just the individual MPs who are elected who are letting us down. Even when good MPs are elected, they very rarely are able to do what Anita just did. They really feel top-down control, and the decisions that are being made in the House of Commons today, yesterday, and next week are more in the hands of an unelected few who run political parties and tell their party leaders and operatives what must be done to advance that party's electoral advantage. So the decision, for instance, are we going to have an election or not in the next few weeks? When do elections happen? And what's dominating the thought process of Jack Layton, Gilles Duceppe, Stephen Harper, and Michael Ignatieff whenever a confidence vote emerges? And I wish I could tell you it was what's in the best interest of my country, what's in the best interest of this planet. But in every case, they're looking at polls. Am I up? Am I down? Am I advantaged by an election right now, or am I disadvantaged by an election right now? And saying it out loud, it's obvious to you. That's what you expect. You think that's of course what they're looking at. But wouldn't it be a fine thing if they weren't? And I think, and it's not just my view, but Peter Russell, who's a professor emeritus in political science at the University of Toronto, has written a number of important books on the subject, but the one that I relied on the most in writing Losing Confidence is his most recent, which is called Two Cheers for Minority Government. And it looks at our political process in Canada and identifies some significant threats to democracy. Lower voter turnout, which of course I've talked about, the increasing power of the Prime Minister's office I referred to briefly. But in diagnosing the reasons for those trends, he lays blame very squarely on the growth of well-financed, well-organized political parties that have undue sway once elections are over. I write in my book that if I was inventing democracy from scratch, I wouldn't have invented political parties. Now, political parties aren't referenced in our Constitution. In fact, in terms of what we do in Canada when we go to the polls, it was worrying during the crisis that occurred last November surrounding Stephen Harper's incredible November economic statement. I use the word incredible in its literal meaning. It wasn't believable and no one could believe it. So it led to a crisis in Parliament in terms of a very close thing to a non-confidence vote that was, again, astonishing and historically unprecedented anti-democratic move to shut down Parliament to avoid the vote. But all of what that did was lead us in the direction of increasing instability in a minority government. And at the time that Stephen Harper was struggling for his political life, he put forward the idea, which this was very worrying, that Canadians could believe for a minute this was true, that the opposition parties were attempting to overthrow the result of the last election. I was actually in the middle of writing my book when this all occurred, and I thought, well, this is astonishing. The results of any election in Canada is the election of 308 members of Parliament. We don't, in this country, elect a prime minister. The only people who vote for Stephen Harper are the people in his riding. So where does it come from? Where does the idea of a prime minister come from? The idea of a prime minister is first among equals. That's the original idea. So 308 MPs under our Constitution, if you talk about overthrowing the results of an election, it would have been perfectly constitutional for the 308 MPs who were elected last year, October 14th, to have gotten to Parliament, and at least 307 of them might have said, is Stephen really the best one for this? What do we think? He doesn't really play well with others. We have a hard time getting him to listen to us. Maybe we ought to pick someone else. There's that independent. He might be good. In other words, that would have been constitutional. We don't think about it because the growth, as Peter Russell has said, in the political party system is so vigorous that it absolutely dominates the system, that we actually think that a prime minister is elected because a political party chooses a leader. And then it's inevitable that the party with the most seats is going to have that person as leader because it violates their party rules to have anybody else take over. Unless you're the Liberals and you want to get rid of Dion, put Ignatieff in without a convention. But other than that, it really is the party structure that dictates who a leader is. It's not part of our Constitution. Now, Westminster tradition has also changed in England as well, although in England you still can have a caucus, such as Margaret Thatcher's, that chose to remove her without a convention in between. So our system of government, as another political scientist, Denise Savoy, has pointed out, relative to our system of government, a Canadian prime minister has more clout and power than either a U.S. president, who has the separation of powers of legislative being over with the Congress and executive being with the White House, or a British prime minister who, like Canada, has both executive and legislative powers, but who can be removed by his or her caucus. So we have a very unusual system in Canada, and the growth of power in the Prime Minister's office is itself a dangerous thing, regardless of who's Prime Minister. And this is something that I think we need to look at. So how do Canadians decide that it's time to get active and engaged again? I think a lot of it has to do with the kind of discussions that we have in popular media, whether it's blog sites, whether it's gatherings of people in universities, law schools, whether it's community meetings, wherever they are, to say we've all got to get out and vote. And next time there's an election day, look around your circle of friends and find out if everybody's voting. And if they're not, convince them that there's nothing more important that they do in a democracy than get out and vote to ensure that they vote for what they believe in, because any other vote isn't going to get you anywhere except for more status quo. This also conveys itself into the courts. we have to have, for a democracy to really function well, people need access to the courts, and that involves, particularly for cases that involve expanding human rights, looking at questions of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I've so wished we could get a case before the Supreme Court of Canada to ask a pretty fundamental question about security of the person. We know what security of the person means in relation to police raids, seizing someone, holding them in violation of habeas corpus, unless, of course, they might be a terrorist, which, again, I think is a really significant erosion of human rights in Canada to make up separate rules for people that you might want to label terrorists someday. But those basic things cannot be tolerated under the Charter and protection of security of the person. But the person it can also be interpreted in a different way. And what I wonder is, can't we get a court case to the Supreme Court that asks, doesn't my charter right to security of the person mean that Monsanto has no right to leave waste PCBs in my tissue? Do I have any right for security of the person in that extent? And does the equal application of law across the country mean that I have a right to be protected in one part of the country as much as another in terms of pollution regulations? There's lots of scope for improving environmental protection in Canada through the courts. But there's less and less access or opportunity to do that. When we lost the Court Challenges program, we lost a lot, because the chance to get a case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada takes funding. And the people most likely to bring those cases are the most marginalized, the least well-funded, the most abused in any system, are the ones who are going to look to, can I expand my rights under the Charter? And certainly environmental groups or individual people affected by toxic chemicals are not the ones most likely to get a case all the way to the Supreme Court. So access to justice at that level has been reduced when the current government got rid of the Law Commission and erased the Court Challenges program, removing it, claiming it was a budget measure because so much money was being spent, when in fact so very little money was being spent. When you realize that the Harper government has delivered a $56 billion deficit this year alone, but thought it couldn't afford $500,000 for the Court Challenges program, the fact that this was an ideologically driven and not fiscally driven move is pretty transparent. But we need to remember that it existed once, because we're going to need to get it back. We're going to need to create access to the courts as well. We know that the Canadian Bar Association has been very concerned about the restricted funds for legal aid. So both on large issues of public policy and personal issues of access to good legal representation for any individual charged with any criminal activity, they have to have access to legal aid, and it has to work for the community that is in fact our legal representation, as it works for people who need legal aid. And that has been restricted through loss of transfer payments, through cutbacks. So we also need access to justice and access to the courts for a whole range of reasons that, again, are integral to what it is to be a democracy. These are all things that you will be grappling with as lawyers. How do you help people pro bono? When you go to work, are you going to be, if you're in the kind of large firm that can afford pro bono work, it's wonderful to do it. It's wonderful to find ways to provide time in your volunteer hours to be available for people who really need access to justice and have difficulty finding it through sheer lack of funds. We need to get back to being the kind of society that recognizes no matter where a ship comes from, no matter where a group of people have come from, when they arrive on our shores and seek refugee status, we need to treat them fairly and equally the way we've treated people who need refugee status at any time in our history. There's a creeping intolerance in Canadian society, a willingness to say when a ship of refugees from Sri Lanka show up that perhaps they should be shipped back and not given the benefit of Canadian law and the justice requirements from the Charter that have been developed and that make sense. If the refugee status can't be established, well, obviously they don't get to stay in the country as political refugees. But it's interesting to note the conviction today or yesterday of someone who attempted political refugee status and was then found guilty of genocide. The system doesn't always protect someone who asks for refugee status. the court system, the refugee system, and the immigration system need to operate fairly to get at the facts. And if someone is at legitimate fear of losing their life if they're returned to their country of origin, we shouldn't return them to their country of origin. Now, these basic things about what it is to be Canadian, to respect diversity, to quest for real justice, to look for social justice, economic justice, and climate justice, demand a real engagement. It demands a moral courage to be able to say that even if the political climate seems to be sliding towards something that doesn't seem to represent our values, that we don't sit back, change the channels, and wait for this to be over so that we can get back to the kind of good Canada that we once were. To get back to what we once were and what we are rapidly losing, we need a very engaged citizenry. We need engaged lawyers, we need engaged students, we need engaged journalists, we need engaged waitresses, shop clerks, and pipe fitters. We need Canadians from coast to coast to say, I'm not prepared to let democracy slip between my fingers because I'm too busy trying to survive in an economic crisis. All of these things are interlinked. And when we find our political power again, we can find justice. Thank you. I'm right on time.
Perfect.
Oh, goody.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is now going to take some questions, so I'm just up here to give her a hand with that. So please feel free.
Help me spot. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
At the beginning, and when you were introducing your topic, you mentioned that citizens have a duty or an obligation to vote. Do you think that there should be a legal duty to vote?
It would be a better solution than the status quo, but it's not as good a solution as giving people the very real sense that every vote counts by reforming our voting system. So before going to mandatory voting as such as they have in some countries like Australia, it would certainly, I think, be preferable to give proportional representation a chance so that every Canadian would know that every vote cast really was counted. And if you look at where voter turnout is declining internationally, and particularly youth voting, I had thought it was a generalized global phenomenon that youth weren't voting as much anymore until I started researching my book. And there, the evidence is very clear. Youth voting is a crisis in 3 countries: Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom, which by coincidence are the only 3 countries that still use the first past the post voting system. So if we could change that to proportional representation, we'd see a number of salutary effects. One thing, I think we'd clean up the toxic nature of politics that I mentioned at the beginning, because one reason politics is so controlled by spin doctors is they're always trying to figure out, well, if a party in opposition says something at all supportive of any of the other parties, will that be used against them later as the voters try to figure out who's the very worst because I want to vote in a way that's strategic and all that kind of nonsense. So we'd have people being able to freely understand that every vote counts and they could vote for the party they most support. And it would also mean politicians would be able to speak freely about moments when, such as I did earlier, I want to give credit where credit's due. That would be positive. More women are elected to parliaments with countries with proportional representation by large measure, and more minority groups are elected. New Zealand just changed from first past the post to mixed member proportional in the mid-90s as a result of citizen engagement in a royal commission and 2 different referenda to get them there. And one of the drivers for them to change their voting system was the lack of Indigenous representation in their parliament. And of course, it's just like Canada, New Zealand, Commonwealth country, House of Commons, Governor General, the whole same system of government, Westminster Parliament tradition. But I thought it was interesting to realize that they really were prepared to change their voting system because it seemed so completely unequal and unfair that Indigenous people weren't taking a proportion in the Parliament equal to their representation in our society, which Canadians should worry about a lot as well. But a lot of Maori people began to get elected once they shifted to from first past the post to mixed member. So did the number of women elected, and they also had their first elected Asian member of Parliament in New Zealand. They also, by the way, have coalition governments and more minorities. But they last longer between elections than our governments have, and they're doing a better job at governing. So, you know, that would be my preference before mandatory voting. Although, you know, as I said, better than nothing. Yes.
Thank you very much for your speech so far. Could you please elaborate on the police interference in the 2006 election?
Elaborating on Zaccardelli. How you all? I mean, I'm older than anybody of the students here, but I mean, how many of you remember the 2005-2006 Zaccardelli press release? Okay, I'm going to review this quickly. The government of Canada fell on November 28th, 2005. It was a minority government led by Paul Martin. I remember the date very precisely because it was also the opening day of the climate conference, the 11th conference of the parties in Montreal. So I was, as Sierra Club of Canada executive director, enraged that opposition parties would bring down a government on such an important day. But going into December, we were really quite near Christmas at the point that something quite remarkable occurred. The background for this is income trusts. You may remember that Stephen Harper had promised not to tax income trusts and then did. Before that, the previous election furor over income trusts was in the lead up to the moment when the government fell November 28th. In that fall of 2005, the government of Canada, when the finance minister was Ralph Goodale and Paul Martin was prime minister, had been struggling with whether or not they should tax income trusts, and they decided not to. But the allegation from an NDP member whom you'll know, Judy Washer-Lascelles, was that, and it was in the papers, was there anything going on? Were there any leaks? Was there any chance that friends of Ralph Goodale knew ahead of time that the income trusts as a vehicle for protecting cash in a corporation would not be taxed? And there was an allegation that perhaps someone had known. So Judy Washer-Lascelles sent a letter to the RCMP requesting a criminal investigation. Now, that was all politics as normal, nothing unusual so far. We get into the election campaign, and suddenly, just after Christmas, there is a public furor because the RCMP commissioner, Zaccardelli, has confirmed in a letter, first a letter to Judy Washer-Lascelles stating that there is a criminal investigation into her allegations, followed by, within about 24 hours, a press release from the RCMP in which Ralph Goodale is named, but he's named as not a suspect at this time. Now, this is extraordinary stuff. Within that week, if you trace the public opinion polls, it went from a 10-point lead to the Liberals to a 10-point lead to the Conservatives, because that election had already been all about one thing: not climate, not Afghanistan, not Canada's economy, but basically a question of whether we could ever again trust the Liberals after the sponsorship scandal. So corruption was the top issue. And people were prepared in terms of polls to give the Liberal minority a chance because, after all, Paul Martin had commissioned Judge Gomery to do an inquiry. He'd been, if there was one person in Canada who seemed more enraged by the sponsorship scandal than anyone else, it was Paul Martin, because he was so angry at Chrétien for having done it. You know, it's all one party, but Martin thought he could distinguish himself from Chrétien just by being more enraged than anyone else. The Angry Man Tour, as it was called at the time. I mean, he was just, well, I've said enraged. I don't know what else to say. He was beside himself with fury. So that's when you suddenly have another corruption issue. And now it's Ralph Goodale is being investigated for criminal leaks that might have benefited his friends with stock market transactions if they'd known income trusts weren't going to be taxed. That was important, secret information that they shouldn't have had. So that alone turned the election to Harper's advantage, a 10-point lead that never reversed itself. Now, the only place where this got investigated was Paul Kennedy, who runs something called the Public Complaints Inquiries into the RCMP. By the way, really important function that body plays, and its budget keeps being cut. So Paul Kennedy and the Public Complaints Inquiry held basically an investigation into what happened. And you can find it and read it online. I use it a lot in my book. It's fascinating. He called everyone he could get his hands on to explain to him what happened with this press release during an election campaign, letter to Judy. Well, he found out some interesting things. Number one, I'll try to make this fast, but this is a fascinating little story. Number one, they didn't just write the NDP finance critic a letter. Right before Christmas, Commissioner Zaccardelli told his staff, we better fax it. We want to make sure she gets it right away. Check and see on December 23rd if they're still in their offices. So the RCMP are calling her Hill office in Ottawa and her parliamentary office in Winnipeg. Of course, there's an election underway too, right? So there's an answering machine. We'll get back to your message after Christmas. Zaccardelli personally ordered that the staff leave messages. We're sending you an important letter. Go look at your fax machine on her Winnipeg answering machine and her Ottawa answering machine. Naturally enough, they check the mail just after Christmas, so very excited. They post the letter from Zaccardelli on their website, at which point Zaccardelli says, now we need a press release. He had his staff prepare a press release. They prepared two versions, one that mentioned Ralph Goodale by name and one that didn't. Zaccardelli personally chose the one that mentioned Ralph Goodale by name. So all of that is done in the context of an election campaign. Kennedy then goes through the rules that exist and says there are no rules for what to do in an election campaign with particularly sensitive information. But he then does provide the rules for it's not sensitive and it's not an election campaign. And under those rules, Judy Washerloss-Lease would not have been considered an informant since she knew nothing about it but was making a political charge. Secondly, the investigation would never have mentioned the name of anyone, whether they were under investigation or not. That specifically violates the rules of how the RCMP handles divulging information. And so the whole piece would have been, they concluded no rules were broken because there are no rules for sensitive information during an election campaign, but guess what? They violated the normal rules when nothing's sensitive. Last bit of important information. They asked Zaccardelli for a statement, and because this commission does not have the powers of subpoena, Zaccardelli refused to give any explanation. A lot of people have wondered, and this is as, again, I'll quote Jim Travers from the Toronto Story, he said he's one of the few journalists who followed up on this consistently. He says it's particularly toxic, even for Canadian politics, to wonder, did Zaccardelli get favors from Harper? Why did he want Harper in power? Did he get more money for the RCMP? Why did Harper shield him when the Arar report first came out saying that the RCMP had known for some time that the charges against Maher Arar weren't real? Why was he then protected for a fairly long period of time until his resignation was accepted when he contradicted Stockwell Day in the media? That was why he finally was asked to resign. And lastly, why did the Harper Conservatives continue to shield the RCMP establishment from RCMP whistleblowers over the pension fund irregularities that happened under Zaccardelli's watch? Were any of these events related? We won't know because the story ends there. No media have followed up on it. Very few people even know that the Public Complaints Inquiry attempted to get to the bottom of it, and that Zaccardelli refused to give evidence. Zaccardelli now has a very comfortable international position with Interpol. So meanwhile, Canadians had, I mean, if it was a third world country where we heard of this kind of thing, that the head cop interfered with an election, and that nobody asked any questions, we'd say, oh, well, you know, there you go. That's what it's like in other countries. But we let it happen right here, and we're still not asking questions. Sorry I took so long on that answer. Yes, on the other.
I was really encouraged by your interest in that statement that you made that climate change discussion would be front and center in democracy. Yesterday, a report was released by the Kennedy Institute, the David Suzuki Foundation, funded by the Toronto Dominion Bank but not endorsed by them, that I think is a landmark report that talks about the economics of climate change and our meeting our commitments to it. Since we don't have C311, the Climate Accountability Act, to use as leverage to bring about debate within our society prior to Copenhagen, do you think there's a potential, or what potential do you think exists
I think it's, thank you for raising it. This report, I agree with you. We as a party, we endorse the report. A lot of the measures that were tested in their economic analysis are part of our program and platform already. Just to fill this in for people, Don Drummond, who used to be the Deputy Minister of Finance in the Canadian government, so really serious, realistic policymaker, and I have a lot of respect for him. He was the one at the TD Bank who made sure they funded this study, and although they don't endorse the recommendations, he has said publicly that the recommendations and the work of the report, that these are robust, which is pretty much giving it his seal of approval. The work that was performed in terms of the nitty-gritty of the economic analysis was done by Mark Jacquard and Associates in BC, a firm that has done a lot of work for Natural Resources Canada, again, a very credible outfit. So while the questions and the study and the policy was designed by Suzuki Foundation and Pembina Institute, the real economic analysis piece was done by Mark Jacquard and Associates. So this is absolutely credible. It is what is absurd is that Jim Prentice, our Minister of Environment, is saying we can so do this without anybody noticing anything. Now, this that he's prepared to do is the current position of the Government of Canada, that we would reduce our emissions by the year 2020 to 2% below 1990 levels. The European Union is working towards a Copenhagen agreement with 20% below 1990 levels, and increasingly scientists are saying we need 30% or more below 1990 levels by 2020. So the report that you've asked about, for those of you who might have missed it, looked at two scenarios. Can we meet the Harper target of 2% below 1990 levels by 2020 with the existing policies the Harper government has announced? And could we potentially reach 20% below 1990 levels with other policy instruments? And the answer to both questions is yes, we could do both, but at the moment we're not even going to come close to this really quite dangerously low 2% below 1990 levels by 2020 because there's nothing in place to get there. So for Mr. Prentice, his vociferous response, it's quite today's paper. He's talking about how it's an outrageous and dangerous report. The Globe and Mail has criticized it as dangerous report. No one's talking about how dangerous it is if we do nothing. If we lose the Western Antarctic ice sheet, for instance, which is a huge volume of ice, it's in the order of I think it's 30 million cubic kilometers of ice, I think. It's a huge amount of ice. If it's dislodged from a land base, it has a significant impact on sea level rise. At the point that I wrote Global Warming for Dummies, I was relying on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that event alone would be a 4 to 5 meter increase in sea level rise. But recently I went to a briefing by Dr. Dick Peltier, who's a professor of physics at U of T, who's doing work with satellite readings on thickness of ice and gravitational pull and how it all would affect whether displacement of Western Antarctic ice sheet would have a different effect in some parts of the world than in others, whether the displacement of the Greenland ice sheet would be different in some parts of the world than in others. And the conclusion was kind of counterintuitive. The Western Antarctic ice sheet displacement actually has a bigger impact on Canada than Greenland. So if we lose the Western Antarctic ice sheet, we're talking about 9 meter sea level rise. Now, I heard this information at a parliamentary briefing for MPs, and I thought, well, I'm bound to hear someone talk about this when we get to question period later today. There were quite a number of Bloc, NDP, and Conservative MPs. I think it must have conflicted with some other meeting because there were no Liberal MPs there. I don't read anything into that. They just weren't there. But I thought surely someone's going to, Jack Layton was there for the briefing. Surely someone's going to talk about this in question period. A 9 meter sea level rise. It was never mentioned. So this report gives us a chance to really dig in and talk about it. How do we each do this? I would ask any of you who are at all interested in the climate issue to go to Suzuki Foundation website, read through the report, and start writing, blogging. Even if you don't even read more than the Globe and Mail coverage of the report, say, I'm ready to see this kind of change. If we need realistic solutions, then these are as good a bunch of clearly stated, unvarnished, cold reality of how we do it, of anything we've been presented so far. And yeah, I'm ready to do it. That's what we need to see, because, by the way, this report shows the Canadian economy will continue to grow. Not that I think growth is a good thing all the time, but anyway, it's going to continue to grow, and we'll have more employment, and things will continue to be, quite secure for a healthy Canadian economy on a prosperous continent that we have. But if we fail to take these actions, all bets are off in terms of whether we can survive the geopolitical instability that comes from, I talked about one boatload of refugees. If we don't act quickly, sea level rise alone will create hundreds of millions of environmental refugees. Droughts and increased severe weather events will create such geopolitical instability that what we're really talking about now is no longer an environmental issue, it's a security threat. So the blindness of the Globe and Mail editorial writers saying this report isn't helpful. Maybe it's time for some new targets. I've got to say, today's paper, there's a wonderful letter from the High Commissioner to Canada from the UK, basically Canada, the US, the UK ambassador to Canada, saying, surely your paper should make the point that new targets aren't about a political negotiation. The atmosphere isn't negotiating with us. This is about science telling us we have to make reductions to a certain level by a certain number. We basically have 5 years from now, maybe 6, to make sure greenhouse gas levels stop rising. These are limits put before us by an atmosphere that will respond catastrophically to ever-escalating greenhouse gas levels. So for the government, for major members of the media to say, well, if we can't make the pathetic, useless target we put forward last time, let's come up with an even more pathetic, useless target next time, because maybe we can meet that, as opposed to grasping the opportunity that exists to redirect our economy in ways that work. I'm just going to pause for a minute before taking another hand and just check, because I want to see if any young women students have a question. I haven't heard from any young women students yet. Yes. Yeah. Who was your incumbent? Just curious. Okay. And he didn't do any debates. Well, the right of citizens to have an opportunity to ask questions in an all-candidates meeting is pretty essential in democracies. Now, in terms of my participation in the debates, you're right. I had a hard time with it, and I'll have a hard time again. Because so far, the Liberals and the Bloc have said they don't mind if I'm in the debates, and the Conservatives and the NDP refuse to answer the question. So we're back to where we were before. I'm going to have a struggle to get in. But I would urge people in ridings where a candidate, incumbent, or anyone refuses to come for the debates to find every possible means to get them to answer questions. If they refuse to be in debates, there should be a barrage of criticisms into the newspapers and on the blog sites and the open line radio shows till they feel forced to appear in a debate. If they don't show up in a debate, they need to have people go into their rallies and stand at the back with signs, "Why are you afraid to speak?" Whatever it takes to drive them out, because that's the time that people get to find out. And by the way, I know people have to get away soon. We're almost at the end of the hour. I think one of the most important questions to ask candidates in an election debate in the future is to ask, if we elect you, who do you think will be your boss when you get to Ottawa? The voters in this riding or the head of your party? I think we need to put it to people very squarely that we want to see representative democracy work, and that means they've got to work for the voters in their riding and not for some set of pollsters and spin doctors that operate out of back rooms in Ottawa. I see a bunch more hands. I don't know what to do. Thank you.
Well, very fabulous. I just, because we have other classes starting at 1 and people have to leave, we do have to wrap up, and I think there is actually another class in here. But before we do, I just wanted to really thank Elizabeth May for her words today, for her example. This is what we hope for our law students that whatever they choose to do in their careers, that they are passionate about that they think about access to justice, about good citizenship and engagement, and just thank you for inspiring us today.
Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Something small from us.
Oh, thank you.